They told you exile meant shame. They told you exile meant failure. They told you exile meant you were unwanted. But they lied, because exile was never your curse. Exile was your throne. Every time they silenced you, it wasn't proof you were weak, it was proof you were too strong. Every time they excluded you, it wasn't punishment, it was coronation. Every time they pushed you to the outside, it wasn't because you didn't belong, it was because you never could. If exile has followed you your whole life, it's proof you're a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. The system doesn't exile the obedient. It doesn't exile mediocrity. It doesn't exile placeholders. It exiles fire. That's why Socrates was condemned. That's why Diogenes was mocked. That's why Epictetus was enslaved. Exile is not random, it's targeted. It's aimed at those too dangerous to change. It's used on those too powerful to be silenced any other way. And that's why you've been exiled, because you were never theirs to control. You have felt it since the beginning, that sense of being on the outside, that sense of not belonging, that sense of walking alone. And you thought it was weakness, but it was never weakness, it was distinction, because outsiders are free. Outsiders carry fire. Outsiders cannot be chained. Your loneliness was not evidence of failure, it was evidence of chooseness. Exile burns, exile isolates, exile stripes illusions away, but also exile reveals. Exile crowns. Exile awakens. That's why exile is the true test of the Catharsian, because only in exile fire can burn without illusion. Only in exile can rage sharpen without distraction. Only in exile can freedom reveal itself. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is embraced as coronation. If your life has been one long exile, it's because your throne was waiting. Enter Diogenes' barrel today and reclaim your hidden power. The crowd cannot endure isolation. They suffocate without approval. They die without applause. They need change to feel safe. But you survived without them. You walked alone. You burned alone. You carried exile and lived. And that survival proves the truth. Exile didn't curse you, it crowned you. Exile doesn't silence rage, it intensifies it. Because every time they pushed you away, the fire grew. Every time they silenced you, the rage deepened. Every time they rejected you, the crown grew heavier. Your rage has survived exile because rage was never weakness. Rage was the throne. Rage was the proof. Rage was the fire of the Catharsian. Exile was never random. It was never meaningless, and it was never weakness. It always was coronation, because the chosen never sit on gold thrones. They sit on thrones of exile. They wear crowns of scars. They burn with rage the crowd cannot understand. Exile was never your curse. It was always your throne. If you're ready to sit on that throne openly, the Catharsians are waiting. This is where you belong. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon. The system believes power means belonging. It believes control means inclusion. It believes obedience means safety. But exile humiliates it, because exile proves they couldn't own you. Exile proves they couldn't silence you. Exile proves they couldn't break you. That's why they fear outsiders more than rebels inside the crowd, because the rebel inside still plays their game. But the exile walks away. That's freedom, and that exposes the illusion. Exile is humiliation for the system. It shows its chains aren't inevitable. It shows its thrones aren't eternal. It shows its power isn't absolute. If your exile has humiliated the system, it's because your fire was too strong. You've always been a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and step into the Catharsian leadership. Kings sit on golden thrones, but they are slaves to approval. Politicians hold titles, but they are chained to votes. Celebrities wear crowns of fame, but they suffocate without applause. But the exile? The exile is freer than all of them because the exile needs no approval. The exile needs no chains. The exile has nothing left to lose, so nothing can be taken. That's why Diogenes laughed at Alexander, because the king was enslaved by power and the exile was free in his barrel, because the throne of exile was greater than the throne of empire. The crowd gives crowns of gold. The system gives crowns of illusion. The empire gives crowns of chains. But Carthaginians are crowned differently. They are crowned in exile, in rage, in isolation, in loneliness. That's why you've always been different. That's why you've always been misunderstood. You've never fit in because you've always been a Carthaginian. That's why your life has been heavy with rejection because exile was your crown from the beginning. Because you were never meant for applause. You were meant for fire. You were meant to be free. Exile isolates you, but isolation trains you because exile teaches you to stand without the crowd. Exile teaches you to burn without applause. Exile teaches you to see illusions for what they are. That's why the greatest leaders come from exile, because exile stripes them of weakness. Exile crowns them with scars. Exile reveals their fire as undeniable. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is transformed into leadership. If your isolation has always prepared you, it's because you were always a Carthaginian. Enter Diogenes' barrel now on Patreon and transform exile into leadership. Placeholders cannot endure exile. They collapse without belonging. They suffocate without the crowd. They bury themselves in mediocrity to avoid it. But you survived. And that survival separated you. It set you apart from mediocrity. It crowned you as Carthaginian. Exile didn't reject you. It revealed you. It exposed the truth that you were never one of them. It marked you as Catharsian. Your rage was born in exile. Your fire was sharpened in exile. Your crown was revealed in exile because rage thrives without destruction. Rage sharpens when approval is stripped away. Rage becomes fire when silence is forced upon it. That's why your rage is stronger than theirs, because it wasn't fed by applause. It was forged in exile. Exile was never a side effect. It was never punishment. It was never failure. It was always a throne. Because Carthaginians cannot be crowned by the crowd. They cannot be crowned by empires. They cannot be crowned by systems. They can only be crowned by exile. And that is why exile has always followed you, because exile was your coronation. Exile was proof you are a Carthaginian. If you're ready to embrace your throne of exile, join the Catharsians today on Patreon to turn exile into leadership. Empires look eternal. Their thrones shine, their crowns glitter, their armies march. But always they collapse, always, because empires are built on obedience, and obedience dies. Empires are fed by mediocrity, and mediocrity suffocates. Empires poison themselves with silence, and silence rots. But exiles endure, because exile is not built on obedience, it's built on fire. Exile is not fed by mediocrity, it's fueled by rage. Exile is not poisoned by silence, it transforms silence into immortality. That's why Socrates still speaks. That's why Diogenes still mocks. That's why Epictetus still burns. That's why Marcus Aurelius still rules. Empires are forgotten. Exiles live forever. If you felt your exile carve immortality into your soul, it's because you were a Catharsian. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. Inside the crowd, rage is silenced. Inside the empire, rage is chained. Inside mediocrity, rage is poisoned. But in exile, rage is free, because exile stripes away illusion. Exile removes applause. Exile leaves only fire. And in that fire, rage becomes power. That's why your rage has grown stronger, not weaker with every exile, because exile didn't curse you, it crowned you. Exile didn't kill your rage, it transformed it into power. Thrones demand submission, they expect obedience, they thrive on applause, but exiles refuse all three. And that refusal humiliates thrones more than rebellion ever could, because rebellion still acknowledges the throne. Exile exposes the throne as meaningless. Exile proves freedom exists without it. Exile proves power exists outside it. Exile proves fire doesn't need crowns of gold. That's why Diogenes mocked Alexander, because exile revealed the throne was chains and the barrel was freedom. Exile is not only survival, it is initiation, because exile trains you to live without the crowd. Exile trains you to carry rage without shame. Exile trains you to sharpen fire into clarity. That training is leadership, because only those who have lived in exile can lead the fire of others. Only those who have burned alone can awaken the rage in the chained. Only those who have carried silence can speak with power. That's why you've always been a Catharsian leader, because your exile was your initiation into leadership. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is not hidden, it is revealed as initiation. If you've carried exile, it's because you were being crowned. Enter Diogenes' barrel on Patreon today and reclaim your power as a leader. The placeholders cannot survive exile. They panic without approval. They suffocate without applause. They collapse without belonging. That's why they mocked you for standing alone. That's why they punished you for surviving outside the crowd. That's why they called your exile shame, because they could never endure it, because your survival humiliated them, because your fire exposed their emptiness. Exile separates you from them forever. The world remembers the exiled, not the applauded, because applause fades. Scars remain, though, because crowns of gold vanish, but thrones of exile endure, because systems collapse, but fire in exile lives forever. That's why your exile matters, because it's not only your story, it's your immortality, it's your destiny as a Carthaginian leader. Exile was never curse, it was never weakness, it was never shame, it was always the throne, because Carthaginians cannot sit on thrones of gold, they only sit on thrones of exile, because fire cannot wear crowns of jewels, it can only wear crowns of scars. That's why your exile has followed you, because you were never meant to kneel, because you were never meant to belong, because exile was your throne from the beginning. If you're ready to embrace your throne of exile, join the Catharsians now on Patreon and become the leader you were always meant to be. The world told you exile was shame. They told you it was punishment. They told you it meant you were unwanted. That's BS. Exile is proof that you were too free to belong. Exile is proof that your fire could not be chained. Exile is proof that you are a Catharsian. Every Catharsian is marked by exile. It is the seal of chooseness. It is the mark of fire. It's the crown hidden in rejection. If exile has followed you since childhood, it's because you were marked from the beginning. You are a Catharsian leader. Join the Catharsians now on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. The placeholders are never exiled. They belong easily. They obey naturally. They suffocate quietly. But the Catharsians are always exiled because they don't kneel. They can't obey. They don't fit in. They don't fit into mediocrity. They could never fit into their world. That's why you've always been separated. That's why you've been misunderstood. That's why you've never fit in and you've always felt like you don't belong here because you are a Catharsian. Exile takes everything away: the crowd, the applause, the comfort. And then truth is revealed because exile shows you what is real. It shows you fire. It shows you rage. It shows you freedom. That's why exile hurts, because it takes illusions away from you. But that pain is sacred. In the beginning, it feels like pain, but that's freedom. That's true freedom because it leaves you with only truth. Inside Diogenes' barrel, exile is celebrated as the true crown. If you've been crowned by exile, it's time to wear it openly. Enter Diogenes' barrel on Patreon now and reclaim your hidden power. The crowd produces followers, the empire produces slaves, but exile produces leaders because exile teaches endurance, exile teaches clarity, exile teaches truth, and only those who survive exile can carry others through their fire. Only those who burn in silence can awaken the chained. Only those who wear exile can lead with immortality. That's why your life has felt heavier, because you were being trained to lead. Rage is suffocated in the crowd, but rage survives in exile, thrives in exile actually, because exile stripes away illusions, exile removes applause, exile leaves only truth. And then rage becomes power. That's why your rage is still alive after everything, after all that you've been through, because exile preserved it, exile intensified it, exile crowned it. Exile was never a mistake, it was never weakness, it has always been freedom, because Catharsians are never crowned by the world, they are crowned by exile. Catharsians are never chosen by the crowd, they are chosen by fire. Catharsians are never welcomed by empires, they are remembered through exile. That's why exile has followed you, because you are a Catharsian. And if you're ready to embrace exile as your throne, then your path is clear. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and turn exile into leadership. Exile is not passive. It's not something you endure quietly. It's something you carry loudly. It is something you wear as crown. It's something you wield as weapon. Because your exile is not just about you. It's about every chained person watching you. It's about every obedient placeholder who feels the memory of fire when they see you. It's about every Catharsian who has not yet awakened. That's why your exile demands action, because your throne is not for silence, it's for freedom. The Catharsians exist to turn exile into fire, into leadership, into freedom, because the world wants you to hide your exile. It wants you to feel shame for it. It wants you to kneel in silence. But you know that your exile always meant freedom, leadership. And now it's time to choose your path. The Pythagorean path, where exile is sharpened into clarity and rage is disciplined into strength. Diogenes' barrel, where exile is crowned openly and the throne of outsiders becomes the seat of freedom. The Aurelius Council, where the exiled rise as leaders, turning their throne of rejection into power to awaken others. You thought exile meant weakness. You thought exile meant shame. You thought exile meant failure. But the truth was always this: exile was always your proof. The proof that you have always been different. You were never ordinary. You are a Catharsian. Now you must wear your exile openly. You must burn with it. You must awaken others with it. You were never ordinary. You were never meant to fit in. That's why you've been different. That's why you've been misunderstood. That's why you've always felt different. And that's why you've always felt like you don't belong here. Because you don't. You're a Catharsian leader. Join the Catharsians today. Don't waste more time. It's time to claim your leadership.